Hello, thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I'm very excited to announce that I am joined by writer Luke Elliott. So Luke, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and talk about one of my favorite horror novels.
Yeah. And I did have Luke and James on earlier for Secret Window. So Luke and James have a podcast, Ink to Film. James is a filmmaker, Luke is a writer. They were on my show for Secret Window, and I was on theirs for Smooth Talk, which is a Joyce Carol Oates novel, or a short story. So I will link to all of that down below. But yeah, did you want to tell people about your writing and Ink to Film, which I am a huge fan of?
Sure, thank you for saying that. For my writing, I have some short stories out right now in a few different markets. If you go to lukeelliottauthor.com, you can see them. In particular, I think if this is coming out in October, so my short story in Reckoning 6, which is a sci-fi short story about a sentient digging machine, is going to be coming out for free to read October 24th. So people can check that out. It's one I'm very proud of. And then for the podcast, we've been going since 2017, weekly episodes, diving deep into books and their movie adaptations, much like Laura does. It's been a lot of fun, diving into that, getting geeky about it and learning about writing and filmmaking. And it's just something I'm passionate about, so I'm always happy to talk about it.
Yeah, and I like that you guys separate a book episode and then you have a movie episode because, for example, for Haunting of Hill House, which we're talking about today, there is just so much to get into with this book, and so there is a lot that we won't be able to get into just because I like to keep them a bit more concise, but I do love that you guys analyze it better because you just separate them out and give them more time for each, the book and the movie.
Of course, on the other hand, you have a more concise, digestible episode length, so there's something to be said for that. We did cover The Haunting of Hill House. We have an episode on the book, and then we have multiple episodes on the Mike Flanagan TV show. So if you're curious to know what we thought of that, check that out. We actually covered this movie we're going to talk about today, the 1963 The Haunting, as a bonus episode for our patrons. But it will be coming out on the main feed at some point. We do release those on the main feed eventually.
Nice. So The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson was released in 1959, and as Luke said, we're comparing it with The Haunting, which was directed by Robert Weiss. It's Weiss, right?
I think.
Robert Weiss, which was released in 1963. So, beginning with just our general book thoughts. I know you're a big fan of this book, right? So what is it about it that you love?
So it's a very different kind of book than what I typically write, but I like to leave myself open, and I like to be influenced by things. So maybe I will, attempt something like this one day. But I love that it's this slow burn, that it's not flashy. It's a highly character-focused novel. We get inside Eleanor's mind, and at first you don't really know why Shirley Jackson is writing it the way she is. We're spending so much time sort of learning about this character and how she is so excited to be free from her home and on the road and having her independence, and she's fantasizing about her life away from, this trap she has escaped. And then, just because we know we're reading a horror novel, maybe we know she's going somewhere where she's going to be trapped again. And sure enough, that's what happens. And I think Shirley Jackson sets up all of that psychology and inner monologue so that we can start to notice that it changes. And her own thoughts subtly shift throughout the course of the novel, and they start getting darker, and they start getting at times violent or just nonsensical. And that idea that we're like slowly watching a character lose her mind is just amazing to me. Like, it's so well done. It's not heavy-handed at all. It's very subtle. Mm-hmm. And I feel like people sometimes read this book and they don't really follow that, and they don't understand that that's what the appeal is, I think, is that slow descent into madness. And reliving it this time by reading it again, I was able to really appreciate that because, I knew exactly what was going to happen this time. I knew the plot, and I could just enjoy the prose. And I think Shirley Jackson's a master, and she has been so influential in the horror genre, influencing the likes of Stephen King and Neil Gaiman and, just Richard Matheson. A bunch of people have cited her as a primary influence for them. And, it's the greatest haunted house story of all time, in my opinion.
Yeah, and speaking of other authors she has influenced, I have my Folio Society edition on display, and it has a foreword written by Joyce Carol Oates.
Oh,
and
nice.
So it was really interesting, to hear her talk about it. And this book, I wasn't expecting it to be so psychological. I went into it really knowing nothing. And so I loved how it really was, just more psychological. And there were times where it just felt kind of like a fever dream where you're just like, yeah, that's the best way to describe it, where Eleanor is just losing her mind and you're just like, wait, what is happening right now? Is this real? Like, is this all in her head? And while it isn't one that like kept me up at night or made me scared of the dark, it is one that will stick with you, and it is very unsettling for sure.
So I wanted to ask you, I think this is good context for this story. Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in hauntings?
So I was actually going to ask you that as well, because so I do believe for sure in like spirits, and I believe there are good spirits and bad spirits, and I believe they can have like a presence. And I do think someone can like be possessed in a way by a bad spirit. I don't quite believe it to the extent that some movies show it.
Sure.
And as far as like poltergeists or things, like I'm not sure to the extent I believe in it, but I do believe in it somewhat. And I think that's part of the reason why certain movies I just can't watch. Like, for the most part, especially modern day movies, anything that deals with like exorcisms or anything, I'm just like, ugh. Like, because
so you haven't
part
covered
of me
The
believes
Exorcist
it
yet?
could happen. It's funny because I used to love scary movies and I loved the movie The Exorcist. But then at some point, like, things shifted and I was like, you know what, I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so never read The Exorcist, but yeah, so I do believe in them to a certain extent. Do you?
So sometimes I wish I did more. When I was young, I did. I was super into haunted houses and ghost stories, and I believed in it. But at some point, around the time I lost my belief in like religion, I at the same time lost my belief in a lot of the supernatural. But I've continued to be fascinated by it. There's a YouTube channel, it's now called The Watcher, I think. They switched. They used to be with BuzzFeed. Now, but they just released their first episode of this their series called Ghost Files. And it's just these two guys who investigate haunted places, and they're very funny. And one of them is an extreme skeptic, and the other one is a believer. And that dynamic is perfect when they're going around these places. And I totally empathize with the skeptic in the show. And I always feel like usually there's a rational explanation for most things. But what's fascinating is, of course, every now and then they get something that's really hard to explain. That doesn't mean there is no rational explanation, but it can be like, I don't really know why that happened, but was it a ghost? No, I don't think so. So I guess that's where I'm at, and I do think that the more you believe in the supernatural, the more stuff like this will actually frighten you.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, I think the appeal to it was like from a craft perspective, seeing how well it was written. And then, of course, I believe in madness, and seeing a character sort of lose her mind is very interesting. And then there is a read of this book where she is sort of making things happen because she is described as having some sort of telekinetic power. And if she's losing her mind and becoming obsessed with this house and the story of the house, I wasn't very sympathetic to that reading when I first read it, but this time around I was noticing that there is enough hints in there that maybe she could be making this stuff happen, which is really fascinating. So is she ultimately like one and the same with Hill House? By the end, it's like who's trapping who, I guess. I still don't know that that's my reading of it, but I'm more open to that reading of it, I guess.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, because there's so many layers to this book. And like I was saying before we were recording, I feel like you could talk at length about this book because, on the surface, it maybe does seem more simple. Or I even saw Goodreads reviewers being like, oh, it was underwhelming. Like,
a lot of people find it very slow.
Yeah, but I loved it though. And I feel like there is so much depth to it.
So I wanted to ask you, hopefully I'm not jumping on your order
no, that's
here,
fine.
but I just have questions I wanted to ask you. So Nell and Theo, to me, their relationship is incredibly fascinating in both book and movie. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that. Like, it's presented as sort of this initially like kind of a sister relationship that develops.
They talk about being cousins or related.
Yeah. But also, I always detected some undercurrents of like actual attraction there. And I know that that's something that Shirley Jackson did write about, but it was at a time where that was very taboo.
Right, so she had to be more subtle.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of companions in this novel and people living together, but they're just friends, and there's a lot of that going on.
Theo, when she talks about her roommate, because the reason she came to Hill House was because she had a fight with her roommate.
Yeah, they were roommates.
But she talks about like decorating their place together, and she uses a lot of we's. And the fight they got into was like a very passionate, like, I'm burning this note you wrote me, or like a book with an inscription. And then in the movie, I read that Claire Bloom, I believe, plays Theo, and they definitely like wanted her they were portraying her as being a lesbian, but because it's the 60s, it was more subtle.
Yeah.
But there are lines, I don't know if this is in the book, but kind of jumping ahead where Eleanor is kind of overwhelmed and having a breakdown, and she's like, there's unnatural things in this world, and I don't want to be like that, like you're unnatural.
Yeah.
And why would
loaded,
she
right?
say that? Yeah.
Well, it could be because she's heard that Theo has also some sort of telepathic abilities, but you could also read it that way. So it's just a great line, and often these lines have double meanings in that way throughout this book. It's just great writing.
Yeah, to talk about Theo and Eleanor, we can just talk about it now, because I do think it's so interesting, because when Eleanor... So they bond really quick initially, and Eleanor is just so relieved to have someone there. And so she forms this love for her in a way, but then she also has times where she's like, I want to see her die, and I hate her.
Well, that's one of the main ways you see that psychology change, is her attitude towards Theo. And vice versa, honestly. Theo starts treating her pretty poorly at times, too.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I was wondering, like, how much of that is being caused by the house or Eleanor herself. I don't know.
I think with Eleanor, though, like, I was relating it to her mom, who she had loved, but her mom she hated and wished would die too, right? So maybe that's the only way she knows how to love someone, is in this unhealthy way where it's a love-hate relationship. And so she feels that way about Theo too, in a way. So that's kind of how I was reading into it.
To back up that point, at the start of the book, I think the very beginning is Nell is pretty angry and thinking about how much she hates the people she's, I think she's like hating on her sister and stuff. She hates the situation she's in. She's a very angry character at first. It's only once she gets away and is in the car that we start to see her as the more like, vivacious woman that she begins the novel as. But there is that very, very beginning where she actually is quite negative, and she kind of returns to that, I guess, in the end. So
yeah,
I do remember from our coverage that my co-host James, who does a lot of the research into the movies, he told me that Robert Weiss got notes from, I think, the studio about how they needed to limit the implications of that relationship, Theo and Eleanor, and maybe any romance. And I think they were told they weren't allowed to physically touch.
Yeah, but they do.
But they do. And I think that was something that like they all decided they were just going to do anyway, and then I guess let them decide to pull the movie if they really didn't want it, because they all thought it was important to have in the movie. So I thought that was a cool story.
Yeah, that is. And I did read that the actress who played Theo, one of the reasons she was drawn to that character was because she thought it would be so interesting to play someone who was gay, but it can't be outrightly shown, and like having that attraction with Eleanor, like we said, kind of a love-hate relationship they have going on. So yeah, which, by the way, on my podcast last week, I'll have released my Rebecca episode, and that was similar, where there were some like lesbian themes, but because it was written in the 30s, it's more subtle. And so it's just interesting how common that happens, right? Which I'm sure when this was released, or when Rebecca was released, it went over people's heads, I'm sure, but today we're more aware of it and can be like, wait a minute.
Oh, I'm sure there are many people who read it and didn't catch on at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But to talk about Hill House. So Hill House, a lot of things about this book, not a lot, certain things about this book made me think of The Shining, specifically with Hill House and The Overlook, because both of them have their own personalities and are like a character itself in the story. And Stephen King, like you said, is obviously influenced by Shirley Jackson. And I think in The Shining, he quotes Hill House, talking about like whatever walks there, walks alone. Yeah.
Which is a great line, by the way. It's one of my favorite openings of any novel, honestly. I'm always bummed that they take out some of it in the adaptations. They always take out the katydids line. And I think it's just because people don't know what that is, maybe, and they don't want to confuse people. But I think it's such a cool little line, and I don't know. I just wish they'd say the whole thing intact, but...
Yeah, and I'm going to read it real quick, actually, because I have it quoted. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against the hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. Which it is interesting how it says... no living organism can continue long to exist under conditions of absolute reality. So it's saying if you're in absolute reality, you're gonna go insane, and Hill House is insane, so it exists an absolute reality and therefore it's crazy. But yeah, such a great line. And then the end of the book it skips the katydids part at the end, but it comes full circle and it has that line once again. Which
is such a cool, like, coming back. Like, sometimes coming full circle in that way can feel a little hokey, but I think it works perfectly here.
Yeah. Definitely. I actually have a few lines about Hill House that I loved, so I'm going to share another one. And it says, "It was a house without kindness, never meant to be lived in, not a fit place for people or for love or for hope. Exorcism cannot alter the countenance of a house. Hill House would stay as it was until it was destroyed."
Yeah, I love this idea of like a evil place, right? And that's something that Stephen King writes about a lot. And he even said, The Shining, you get the haunted hotel, definitely affects characters psychologically. So you can see the direct line there. And then you get It. You have basically, he said he wanted to write a story about a haunted town. And that's also what's going on there. So, I mean, just that influence is pretty monumental if you think about it. It's very cool.
Yeah. And something else I noticed with Stephen King, which both of us have read a fair amount of Stephen King. Mm-hmm. I've been reading a lot of him this year, so he's definitely in my mind. But Stephen King will oftentimes like have a repeated phrase throughout a book.
Yeah.
And this book does it as well. Yeah, where Eleanor keeps saying the phrase "journeys end in lovers meeting."
Yeah.
So what did you make of that?
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same. It's a very interesting line because I think she's quoting a poem or something.
I think it's Shakespeare.
Okay. And I think when she says it, it has a different meaning in different times. And so that's what makes it kind of hard to pin down. But sometimes it seems like it's aspirational. Like she does seem like she wants some sort of romance. I think in the book it is more implied that it's either with Theo, but she feels like she can't, or maybe with Luke, but maybe they're not a good match. Never really.
But also even with Hill House too, in a way.
Well, I was going to say, never really the doctor in the book. But yeah, then there are times where the romance, I think, definitely shifts to, well, actually, I fall in love with this house. And it's really striking when you consider the first time she sees it, she's using words like disgusting and vile and, like
and she feels like she should
absolutely
leave.
Repulsive. As soon as she sees it, she's like, it's wrong, I need to leave. And then now she's all of a sudden like, this is my home, this is where I belong.
Yeah.
And so you don't know, like, is that because the house has beguiled her, or is that, her somehow accepting and embracing that even if this space is weird, it's still this, like, big house and I want to have my own space and I can just lean into it and this can be my space. I don't know that I like that reading, but I think it's there. Like, I'm sure there are people who like reading it that way. I still think Hill House is evil here and twisting her mind into making her think that that's true. I mean, she dies, which I assume we're full spoilers for this entire discussion. Yeah. Right? Okay, good. Yeah. I mean, she basically kills herself at the end, so that's not exactly a good ending, I guess, although she now lives there forever. But the other thing I think that lines up that is a tragic ending is there are moments in the book where she talks about how much she is afraid to be alone. And she even says, like, I think it's her greatest fear is to be alone. She doesn't want to be alone. She never wants to be alone for most of the novel. She wants to have Theo there. She wants to have her door open, all this stuff. And then that last line says, whoever walks in Hill House, walks alone. So I think the implication being that she is now essentially forever alone in Hill House is not a positive ending for her.
Which, yeah, I read somewhere, I forget where this was, but the line where it says, when it's describing Hill House in that opening quote, where it says the doors are sensibly shut.
Yeah.
So that could mean, because there's different spirits in a Hill House, but are they all locked away in their own rooms and they're like all alone? They're together in the house, but they're alone with the doors shut. I read that could be an interpretation of that line.
Yeah. It's so fascinating because I'm just thinking about like writerly things. We're told not to use a lot of adverbs. Shirley Jackson uses a lot of them here. And she uses them in situations like that. So like when she says sensibly shut, whose like judgment is that? Because there's someone making a judgment about it being sensible. So the assumption is it's the authors, and so that is sometimes seen as kind of intrusive, and so people don't like that as much in like modern writing. So I don't know if that's just a sign of different times, but I think it's a really cool effect because you get this several different times when it's talking about the house and it personifies the house, and you get a sense that the house has an opinion and it has an agenda. Just the way it's described in general with like how there's no right angles. They get lost in there constantly. They lose track of time. There's different moments in the book where they don't know what day it is. they just seem like they're all just sort of lost in there in multiple ways. And I don't know if you've ever been in a lot of these like older big buildings that were built in like 1800s, but like when I went to my master's at Seton Hill University and got my MFA, that building is very old, and there's a lot of like these old winding hallways and stuff isn't at right angles, and then they've like added to it over the years, and there's like suddenly there's a hallway that shouldn't be there, and then there's like a stairway that goes up to a wall, and it reminds me of like descriptions of the Winchester house, which I've never been to, but I know was, I think, an influence on Shirley Jackson.
Yeah, which she mentions it in this book, right? There's a part where the doctor is naming different houses, which I have been to the Winchester house. I did a tour there a few years back, so that was pretty cool. Yeah, and that one was made to not make sense because she had people working on it 24/7, and it's so bizarre.
There's a lot of lore around that too. Like, was it her guilt over her Winchester?
The people who were killed by the Winchester rifle.
Or something else. Yeah, I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. But to get on to Hill House's history, so in the movie we hear this in the beginning, which I did love that sequence in the movie as it tells us the history of Hill House. And I did think there were some really cool angles, just very distorted angles in this movie, and the part where the companion commits suicide by hanging herself, and the way that was shot was just very...
well shot.
Yeah.
So Robert Weiss was the editor, if I'm remembering correctly, on Citizen Kane, and he was the director of The Sound of Music.
I did see that,
and a couple other like really famous, I think, musicals. I think maybe West Side Story. So he's a pretty famous director, and he's now doing this horror movie, but like he's bringing his full powers here. And this movie is really excellently shot. I'm not usually someone who loves a lot of like older black and white films, but this one I think is really good, and it stands up to this day. And like you're saying, like there's a lot of really interesting filmmaking going on, considering we spend most of the time inside a house, which seems like it could be boring to shoot. But the thing that I really, really love that they did was the use of mirrors. In every scene, almost, there's like some sort of mirror that is almost always at a weird angle. So usually they're like kind of angled down or like sideways, and you see characters from different angles. And it adds a sense of depth to the room, but also there's all this lore about like the reversing of a mirror and like the other realm, and you're seeing the other side and all this stuff. Yeah. And often there's even moments where we see like a character running, and then there's the reveal that we're actually looking in a mirror, and that's where the shot's going through, and then you get dirty mirrors and broken mirrors. Like it's cool, and I think it's all playing with like visual motifs that play into the idea of the other side and the other realm that maybe the Hill House coexists in.
Yeah, in this movie, it doesn't have any like frightening images, which I feel like a lot of movies these days definitely do that. And that's why like newer scary movies, it's those frightening images that really like get stuck in my mind. And so this movie, I don't think it's as scary because of that. But then at the same time, it does leave it up to your imagination, right? So there is something about that as well.
Different kind of horror. And it's something that I agree. I think I wish more people would lean into this. Now, there is something to be said for like people are more desensitized nowadays. So
that's very true.
You worry a little bit that just people won't find it scary. And ultimately, if you're writing horror, you want it to seem scary.
To be scary.
But I think it's a good to remember, because it's easy, I think, especially for newer writers, to go for shock. It's very easy to be like, I'm going to describe something shocking. I'm going to describe something that's very gory. Maybe something that will make someone feel ill. This is all fairly easy to do if you just set your mind to it. What's harder is to build a creeping dread, and that is something that this book is like a masterclass in that. So if you want to like learn how to do that, I highly recommend this book. Now I need to read more Shirley Jackson because maybe this is just a hallmark of all her writing, and like this is what people love about her. And I know there are a couple other adaptations. I think like We've Always Lived in the Castles one, and there's a few other. I want to return to her at least on our podcast because I'm such a fan now that and it's just a good lesson, I think, for any writer who wants to learn like other ways to do horror.
Yeah, and I do love horror movies or books where it's about the haunted house, but more than that, more than like the hauntings they're experiencing, it's about what it brings out in them, which is what we see in Eleanor, right? It's about what this house, the darkness within her, that it brings out. So yeah, I think that's just so interesting and harder to do, I would think, like you said, rather than just the shock value or the gore or the frightening images.
And Shirley Jackson is so clever in how she does it, because we haven't even talked about how like the whole setup of this novel is that this doctor is going to be running a scientific experiment to try and figure out if like haunting is real. And so he's bringing in people, and it's starting from a skeptic's point of view. And he's talking very scientifically about things. He's saying how there are certain unexplained phenomenon, and he's trying to understand them so they can figure out what they are. And for someone like me who's a skeptic, this is like a perfect way to invite me into a story. Because I'm like, okay, there's a character here who actually is like thinking about things rationally, and I want to see that. Like, and that's why I can't stand most ghost hunting shows, because it tends to be a bunch of true believers who are like freaking each other out and jumping at every sound. And I'm like, so like I need, you know, on the other show, I need Shane to be there and to just be like laughing at everything and going, this is ridiculous. Like that to me is so important, and this book does that. Even as we see the you know, haunting is real here, because we're in, you know, a fictional world where that can be at least theoretically possible, and whether or not it's haunting or telekinesis, I guess. But something supernatural is happening for sure. Yeah. And yeah, it's amazing. And I love that Shirley Jackson chose to approach it that way. And that's one of the things that I was kind of missing. I won't spoil our coverage of it, but early on for the show, that Mike Flanagan series, it's very different. It's kind of loosely adapted from this. And the story is very different. And one of the things I kind of missed was that investigation approach. Like, it's kind of dropped. It's not really... There's a little bit of ghost investigating stuff that goes on with one of the characters, but it's not front and center like it is here. And I kind of missed that. And I remember that was a series where my opinion on it changed a little bit, because early on I was very resistant and I wasn't really liking it. And then stick with me, because in the second episode we released about it, I kind of shifted and I ended up really liking it, because I finally kind of caught on to what he was doing, and there's a couple of really great episodes. So if you listen to our Hill House coverage, you might notice that at first I'm not as big a fan, and I think that upset some people, because there's a lot of Mike Flanagan fans out there who really, really like his stuff. Yeah,
and speaking of skeptics, which Theo also was a character in book and movie where she didn't take it too seriously, it seemed, and she wasn't, you know, like Eleanor, of course, is the one who is so heavily influenced, and you could also see that as her just not having doesn't have like a strong sense of self, whereas Theo and Luke and Dr. Montague, they had more confidence, and maybe they're also more skeptical, and so they therefore aren't as heavily influenced as Eleanor was. And so yeah, it was just interesting seeing, which I know we're focusing more on Theo and Eleanor, but it was interesting seeing how the other characters were or weren't influenced by the house.
Yeah.
Which I guess we can get into like the first day and night in the house. So Theo and Eleanor, so they hear this banging going out throughout the halls, and so their rooms are adjoined, so they're connected. So they're huddling together while this is happening. And then the doctor and Luke had been outside because there was like this phantom dog they were chasing, but once they come back inside, the pounding stops, and then they come to Theo and Eleanor, and they're like, what was going on? Because they hadn't heard that noise. And so it's interesting because they have this night, especially Theo and Eleanor, where they're so terrified, but then the next day they all feel like so rejuvenated and refreshed, and they're all in like a great mood despite the scary night.
Yeah.
Like that, for me, that reminded me of like when you're with a group watching a scary movie or going to a haunted house and you're so terrified, but then it's like an adrenaline rush, and then it gives you this high, and then you feel like bonded to the people you were with. And so that's what that made me think of.
Yeah, it's kind of the appeal of horror sometimes, right? Like, and they can be really fun to watch in a group for that reason. I totally agree. The thing that I think of with that scene is how you mentioned, right, like they didn't hear it at all. And there's a later scene where Eleanor's thinking, it's like there's like a similar scene later where there's pounding again towards the end. Mm-hmm. And she thinks like, how are they hearing it? It's coming from inside my mind.
Yeah.
And that was another moment where I was like giving fuel to that theory of maybe she's causing it. And if I think back about that original scene, Theo has that telepathic ability a little bit. And it seems like the one thing she's really good at is reading other people's minds. And so it could be her ability to like read Eleanor's mind that is enabling her to hear the same stuff that Eleanor is hearing, which honestly, the pounding, right? Like that's very similar to what her mother did.
Yeah, because she would pound on the wall when she needed Eleanor.
So it's almost like she's haunting herself. Like, I don't know. I'm more open to this theory now. Maybe I'll talk myself into it, but
yeah,
I still want to think that the house is evil and doing a lot of this, but maybe it's using her own trauma to sort of torment her.
Yeah.
And then because of her sensitivities and because of Theo's sensitivities, they are able to experience it together in that moment.
Yeah. And in the movie, the next morning she's talking to the doctor and he's like wanting to get her to know her. And so she like tells him different facts about herself. And in the book, we have a scene like this, but she's thinking like in her mind, I think it's the first night where she's just thinking of like who she is and what makes her Eleanor. And so I did think this was really interesting throughout the book, like I said, like her sense of self and knowing who she is, because her whole life she's been living with her mom, taking care of her mom. She never had freedom, never had the chance to figure out who she is. And then the next day there is writing on the wall in chalk saying like, Eleanor, come home. And she is so upset that the house like knows her name. Also, side note, as far as names, there's a part where I think the previous night Theo is talking about Hill House and she keeps saying it by name, and Eleanor is like bothered that she's calling Hill House by name. And so just the power in name and identity.
Definitely the identity stuff. Like, she keeps losing track of who she is, and she's like, these are my feet. They're attached to me. You know, and I'm like, that's a weird thought to have. Like, she keeps like, but it's such a brilliant way to show that she is losing herself to this house. I did want to, okay, so there is at least a little bit of evidence that Luke might have been the one who wrote that phrase. He's the only one out there when it happens. But also, and I picked this up more on my second read, the little bit we get from his, I don't even know if it's from his perspective or just things he says, but it seems like at first he is very like, I don't know that I want to own this place. And then like later as the novel progresses, he actually starts to become more and more interested in owning it. And like he wants it to be his place and he wants it to be his. And if the house is manipulating him to try and sort of amp up those feelings and make it his own, I could see it sort of leading him, and then, you know, maybe him manipulating Eleanor, because he knows he can sort of torment her by writing this thing out. And I think at that same moment, he also is supposed to be going to see Mrs. Dudley to ask her for, like, coffee or something at the time where she's not supposed to make it. And he just says, like, oh, she said no. But that was the only little bit we get. So, like, he's been out there for a little while, enough time where he could have gone to talk to her, and then supposedly he saw this writing. I don't know. Maybe Luke's up to something. Yeah. It's just enough to where, like, you can kind of maybe believe it. Which, by the way, Mrs. Dudley is awesome in the book. She's okay in the movie, too, but she's such a, like, nice little comic relief to me. Like, I just found her hilarious. Like,
which... I forgot there was another quote I wanted to share that I thought was funny in regards to the companion in Hill House's history. One of the sisters had this companion, and then the companion hangs herself, and it says, gossip says she hanged herself from the turret on the tower, but when you have a house like Hill House with a tower and a turret, gossip would hardly allow you to hang yourself anywhere else. And then you have Mrs. Dudley, who also brought comic relief, and then Mrs. Montague, who we'll get to in the book, was also just like ridiculous and funny. She was obsessed
with planchette, which is something that unfortunately doesn't make it into the movie, but it was perfect.
But with the writing, there is a part that wasn't in the movie, and there's writing on the wall again in Theo's room, but it's in red. I don't think it says like it's in blood, but it definitely
Someone
looks
claims
like
it's in blood, but then I think they're like, no, this can't be blood. This has to be paint maybe, or like, I don't remember if it was nail polish or it was something else, I think.
Yeah, and they ruined Theo's clothes too and like ripped them, and they were like soaked in this red stuff.
Yeah.
And so then Theo has to wear Eleanor's clothes, and this just contributes to Eleanor losing her sense of self.
Well, and Eleanor and Theo's antagonism for each other. They get really nasty towards each other towards the end.
Yeah, definitely. Which, it's funny because they have this antagonism, but then there's the part where Eleanor wants to go home with Theo. Yeah. But Theo shuts it down, and she's like, I'm not in the habit of taking home strays. Yeah. And so, like we said, she hates Theo, but then at the same time, she's drawn to her.
I love that made it into the movie. That's one of the things that I like most about the movie is that the weirdness of Theo and Eleanor's relationship totally comes across. Because this is very strange in the movie as well. And, you know, that totally translates. And I think is one of the most interesting parts of that is how do they actually feel about each other? How much is the house influencing this? And how much of it is just like them being strange people? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm going to be curious to hear your thoughts about the casting and like the performances of each character. I don't know if that's part of your outline. So of our main four, like maybe let's start with like least important to most important. So like Doctor and Luke, like how did you feel about their portrayals in the movie?
Yeah, I thought they were fine. I didn't have any like distinct thoughts on either of them. I mean, Russ Tamblyn, like I said, I know him from musicals, so it was funny, which I think he's in Twin Peaks too, which that was, the 90s.
Okay.
But as far as him being younger, I recognized him from these musicals, so I was like, oh, that's so weird he was in this. But I read that he was hesitant to be in this movie, but his contract forced him to. And so initially he was like, I don't want to do this. But then, like in hindsight, he looks back and he's like really glad he was in the movie.
Yeah. My only qualms with him, and it's just personal taste, I think they tried to make him a bit of comedic relief, and by doing it they decided to make him into this like full-on like Rat Pack like just like 60s wise guy, constantly cracking jokes, many of them misogynist and making a lot of innuendos. And I don't know, like there was a little bit of that in the book, but it was so much more just like a piece of his personality where he was like occasionally cracking jokes and being a little bit like a comic relief, where it was almost kind of winning. Whereas here it was completely off-putting. I was like, I would really detest this guy in real life.
Yeah.
So I almost found him kind of annoying, and there wasn't a lot of redeeming qualities for me in the movie of him. I had more of an issue with the Doctor, but not his character, but like the relationship that they imply, or the attraction that they apply between him and
with Eleanor. Yeah, like she was hoping something would happen, but then the wife shows up.
The wife's like, here. Oh no, and I'm like, yeah, this is not present in the book at all. This is something they completely add for the movie, and very strange. It's like I think they're trying to draw away from that like potential lesbian romance going on. Mm-hmm. They're trying to say like this is a lot more digestible for audiences, even though it seems like he's a lot older. Although I don't know that he actually is. Like I think the actress was older than most of the other actors in the movie that played Eleanor.
Oh, interesting.
But then when I was rereading it, it does say that Eleanor is like 34. So that's what that's what I had forgotten. I thought Eleanor in the book was pretty young, but 34. I mean, she's an adult, and she just has this kind of childlike personality.
Right. And probably due to the fact that she was living with her mother up until a few months ago, right? And so
we've both talked about how much we like Theo, but I'm curious to know, our main character, Eleanor. How did you like her movie portrayal?
I thought she was good. They do a lot of voiceover, which I guess you kind of have to because we're in her head so much. I feel like there wasn't anybody where I was like, wow, like that's a standout performance. So no one blew me away, but then I also didn't find any of them to be terrible either. But yeah, so I thought she was fine, and she definitely had that timid, shy part to her. And then when she gets, flustered and overwhelmed and starts to go a little crazy, I thought she was good, but I wasn't blown away.
I thought she was okay. I think the standout performance for me is Theo. I actually really liked her performance. So if I had to pick anybody who I thought was really good, it would be her. But Eleanor, I was very mixed about. I thought she had a very stagey performance, and I think I read that the actress had a background in stage. A lot of them do at this time period, and it felt like to me like she was kind of over-emoting a little much. And I would have liked a little bit more of a subtle performance from her, because sometimes when she's getting onto these like full-on dramatic moments, it got to be a little much. It wasn't enough to like turn me off to the movie, but I missed the subtlety of the book.
And I think that is common in older movies. I noticed that more, where people are a bit more over dramatic and over emoting, like you said, where it's like, you can like tone it down and be a bit more subtle. So I agree.
It was clever though. I mean, there was a moment where she was like, so a lot of that VO, like I have a very mixed feeling about VO in general when it comes to adaptation. Sometimes it works well. I'm thinking about like American Psycho. I think it was brilliant to have the VO in there. But other times, it really doesn't work well, and it can totally sink an adaptation. Here, I'm more mixed on it in general, because it's kind of heavy-handed early on, but I get why they do it, because they're setting up what happens later, and what happens later is actually pretty interesting, and you do kind of need to be able to follow her mind, right, for all the reasons we talked about, and see her changing thought patterns. And there's like these really cool moments where she kind of steps away from the rest of the group, and the group gets dark behind her, and she has this like almost monologue with the camera, although it's all in her mind. So yeah, it works at times. And then moving on to Mrs. Montague in the movie, as well as the ending, because she ties into the end of the movie. So Mrs. Montague in book and movie is very different. But in the movie, she shows up and she's a skeptic, and she wants to sleep in like the most haunted room, which is the nursery. Which admittedly I would want to do, so I get it.
And so Dr. Montague, he's like, for safety reasons, the rest of us should all be in the same room together. And so they all go in the study while Mrs. Montague is in the nursery. They hear the pounding, and there was that great scene where like the door is like bulging, which was really well done.
Cool special effects.
And then they want to check on the wife, but they're like, no, we can't do that. And then this is, in book and movie, at this point is when Eleanor seems to like just give herself to the house, and she just gives in. And so she runs out. She goes up the staircase, which is the staircase where the companion had killed herself. And so she goes up there, and then everybody comes out of the room and they find her there. And then again, this is different from book to movie, but in the movie, the doctor goes up and he brings her down. But while she is up there, she like freaks out because she's looking up, and then the doctor's wife had been in the attic, and she like she's alive. alive. But like she looks out from above the attic and Eleanor is the only one who sees it. And so she freaks out. But no one believes her because no one else saw it.
Almost a little jump scare in there in the movie.
Yeah. Which, I feel like that was maybe the only jump scare where you're just like, whoa.
One other time with the wife, like when she's about to hit the tree, the wife jumps out again.
Yeah. Yeah. So at this point, even though it's nighttime, in the book they say nobody leaves Hill House at night because if they try to, they die. That's not said in the movie. So that night they're like, Eleanor, this is too much for you. Clearly you can't handle it. You need to go. And so she's in the car, and in the movie, Luke was supposed to be with her, but he gets out of the car, and when he's gone, she starts driving. And then in the movie, it seemed like she's losing control of the car, and maybe she thinks it's Hill House. Yeah, Hill House doesn't want her to leave. And then she's thinking how, like, why aren't they stopping me? And then after thinking, why aren't they stopping me? She then is thinking like, wow, like I'm really doing this. And then the wife pops out, distracts her, and she hits a tree. So in the movie, it was like, did she mean to hit the tree? Or was it just being startled by the woman? Or was it Hill House making her hit the tree? Yeah. And so what did you think of this?
I mean, I prefer the book's ending where her last thoughts tragically are like, all of a sudden she has clarity. And I think that's when she's like, wait, why am I doing this? This is, why aren't they stopping me? Why am I doing this? And then she hits the tree. Yeah,
and the movie switches it where at first she thinks, why am I doing this? And then she's like, I'm really doing this. So,
and then I agree. The other thing about the movie that was, to me, kind of weird is when they all run out and she's dead and the doctor's like, she's dead. And then they all just kind of stand around and talk for a little bit about, it's her own fault. This house is evil. And like they just have this like weird conversation. I'm like, there's a dead person that like you just briefly looked at on the ground. I don't know. I'm too like this my suspense of disbelief left me a little bit there. It didn't seem like they were treating this serious moment as much as, with as much seriousness as they should. No one else has died at this point in the movie or book, so this should be a pretty shocking,
big deal
moment. And instead, everyone just kind of shrugs it off. Like Theo doesn't look that upset about it. Like it was kind of strange, to be honest.
Yeah, and I didn't love too that like Mrs. Montague is what spurred her to possibly crash too. Yeah. I like in the book that it seems like it was Eleanor, but also Hill House.
Well, I mean, it is still maybe Hill House because Mrs. Montague, although it's Marquay, I think in the movie.
Yeah, anyway, the movie does change it.
They changed the name for unknown reasons. She says, like, I don't even know how I got out here. So there's an implication maybe that the house manipulated her into being there in that moment. So you could still say it's the house's fault.
Yeah. Yeah, and when they're telling Eleanor to go, Eleanor is like, no, I want to stay. Like, I should be in Mrs. Montague's place. Like, that should be me, not her.
She's jealous of Marquay in the movie. And it totally makes, and actually that does make a lot of sense. I kind of like that. Like, she's really jealous of Marquay, and she's like, she can't, like, she's where I'm supposed to be that. And she's taken my place. In the book, I did, in that second read, I was appreciating how she justifies it to herself and about how she is almost doing it for the protection of everyone else. She's like, I'm going to give the house what it wants. It wants me. I want it. Once we sort of can agree that I'm going to live here harmoniously, it's almost like she's going to like prevent anything bad from happening to anybody else. At least that's what she convinces herself of. So you can kind of see the thought process a little more, whereas in the movie it did feel a little bit more like she just snapped, which she does in both, but I just the thought, like one thing led to another a little more logically to me in the book.
Yeah. And in the book, so it's definitely, they switch up the events a tad bit, like they condense things in the movie, as movies always do, but she has the night where there is like the pounding on the doors and they're all in the same room together, and this is when she's like, how can they hear it when it's coming from my mind? And this is when she just, like she says, she abdicates herself and she's like, I'm not going to fight it anymore. But then the next day, like she just feels really connected to the house, and there's at one point where she's sitting and she's like, wow, like I know everything that's happening in the house, and it seems like she has become one. Yeah,
that was a cool moment. She could hear stuff going on in other parts of the house.
Yeah. Neat. And there's also a part where I don't know, I think it's this day where she is like eavesdropping on other people's conversations, wanting to hear what they say about her. And two different groups, they talk about everyone in the house except Eleanor. And so at that point you're like, wait, does Eleanor even exist? Because like no one is talking about her. They're mentioning everybody else except her. And then there's also the part where Theo is wearing Eleanor's clothes and Luke is saying something about how she looks like Eleanor, and she's like, I am Eleanor.
Yeah. It's very weird. I love that stuff. And speaking of weird, there's a scene we kind of jumped over here, but it's in the book only, not in the movie. There's this moment where they're walking in the garden, which at first the garden feels like it's kind of an escape from the house, but then like weird shit goes down in the garden too. And in this moment, they're walking, and all of a sudden that the trees are all white, and the path they're walking on is black, and they arrive at this picnic with these children, but they're like terrified, and then they run, and then like Eleanor never looks back, but I think Theo does, and ominously says like, I looked back, and like, so you're like, what does that mean? Like that, like, what did you see? And we don't ever know, and it's that whole like, you know, of course, like the unknown being more frightening sometimes than the known, but I just thought that was a really cool surrealist sequence in the book that, you know, unfortunately, certainly in a black and white movie, you couldn't do it the same way. You'd have to find some other way to do it.
So then the next night, Eleanor, she like says she's gonna go and get a book from the library, but really she just starts like knocking on doors and running around.
Which she's doing the things that the poltergeist did, right?
And then she goes downstairs, and there was a part where Theo had like pretended to dance with the statue of the previous owner, and so then Eleanor does that as well, and then similar to the movie as well, she goes up those staircases, or that staircase, which is super rickety and dangerous. But in the book, Luke is the one who goes up to help her down. And I thought this was funny and interesting how Luke isn't like trying to be kind and talk soft to her. He's like, hurry and get down before I push you off.
He had a moment where he could have been kind of heroic, but no. He's like, you better get down. I'm going to toss you off of this thing. He's mad, I guess. There was a cool detail I remember from our movie coverage where James told me that. Do you remember the scene where the camera advances up the stairs and like follows the twisting stairs all the way up to the top? He told me that to shoot that, they created like a rig that used gravity to slide backwards down the stairs. And then they just reversed the shot to make it look like it was ascending. Because at the time, like those like cameras couldn't do that kind of movement. So this was sort of revolutionary. So it's pretty cool, like whenever little things like that are able to come out in these old movies, and you see that like nowadays we take that for granted. Like of course they can do that, but like these were massive cameras, and so it's really hard to pull off a shot like that.
And then in the book, after the staircase incident, when she comes downstairs, she kind of sort of comes to herself again. And again, they can't leave Hill House at night. So after this, they all go to bed. And the next morning, everybody is being very polite and not mentioning anything at breakfast. But then after breakfast, they're like, you know, Eleanor, like, you need to go.
Yeah.
And Luke, like you said, how initially he like wasn't wanting to own the house, but he is like, you're not invited here anymore. Like, this is my house and I want you to go. And this is when, in the movie, we see in the beginning that Eleanor lives with her sister. But in the book, I don't think we see that, right? It's not until the end she reveals, like, I have no apartment. I'm living on my sister's floor. Like, I don't have anywhere to go. Like, nobody wants me. Yeah. Like, Hill House is the only place that wants me. You can't make me leave.
She says something to that effect in the book, too. I'm not sure if it's, I'm not sure what was changed, but there is that reveal that she has been lying about it.
Yeah. And in the book and movie, she lies a lot about herself and who she is. And there's the part in the book, too, we didn't mention, but she sees a little girl who talks about drinking out of a cup of stars.
Yeah.
And Eleanor starts talking to Theo about that as if, you know, that's hers. And she, like, different things she notices on the drive, like the lions, she adopts as her own and helps create this fantasy that she tells people about.
Which, like, she's building a fantasy, and you could see her, if that is the way her mind works, and she has these telepathic abilities, and now she's in Hill House, and she starts building another fantasy about the haunting and living there. If she has the power to do that, I don't know, more potential fuel. So going back to that moment in the opening, I also got the implication this time that maybe because she thinks at the little girl, don't let them take your cup of stars. Don't say yes. Don't say yes. And then the girl does not say yes. And at the time, I totally missed it the first time. But the second time, I was like, maybe that's her telepathy.
Influence?
Like, maybe she's actually putting that thought into the girl's head.
Yeah.
So, again, like, maybe we're seeing her start to manipulate. And if you're, like, a lot of those early scenes, if you look at it through that lens, there is some implication that maybe she is putting thoughts into people's heads.
Mm-hmm. And then also, like you said, as far as Eleanor causing this to happen, like, she could have caused the writing on the wall to happen, right? Because she wanted to feel special, right? And that was one reason she liked that she was invited to Hill House, was because, like, you know, finally something exciting is happening to me, and like I'm feeling special because I got this invitation.
And everyone keeps accusing her of trying to make everything about herself. And it's interesting because whenever they said that, I was always like, really? Like, that doesn't seem like that's what she's doing. But it plays into that paranoia she has, and maybe there is some implication that she's doing that. and they're calling her on it. Because we're only in the book, I think it's important that like we're mostly getting her point of view. We get a couple times where we come out of it and it's kind of omniscient, but we're mostly very close to her point of view. So could she be a little bit unreliable in the way that she's describing these moments and these scenes? I think it's possible.
Yeah. And in the book, like we said, she hits the tree, and in the book, like she's choosing to do this because she feels like I took it as like she feels she has nowhere else to go. Like nobody wants her except Hill House. So she's going to stay at Hill House by committing suicide. And then in the book, after that, like we get a brief scene of seeing what the other people did. Like Theo went back to her roommate and Luke went off to Paris and, you know, everybody left the house basically. And then, you know, it goes back to normal the way everything had been. And so I thought that was so interesting. Kind of, I took it again to show like maybe the events with Eleanor were so insignificant in a way because
she just gets absorbed now. She's part of the house.
Yeah, and we don't even see the people's reaction to her car crash either.
Right, yeah. Well, I prefer that to seeing the weird subdued reaction we get in the movie. But Luke, I think in the movie says it should all be burned down and then salt the earth afterwards. So it seems like he's ready to burn it down, and maybe that's what happened. So again, like there's potentially another shift in the movie being almost a little more hopeful or satisfying, I guess, to like someone who wants a happy ending in the sense that like maybe the house gets defeated.
Yeah.
Whereas, yeah, the book does not imply that the house gets defeated at all.
Yeah. And then also, so in the Joyce Carol Oates foreword, she talks about Eleanor like being a sacrifice to Hill House. And so like the other guests are using her as a sacrifice. And then in the movie too, they say like, you know, 90 years ago on this day, one of the previous wives of Hugh Crane had died. And so on this anniversary, Eleanor dies. So like,
and Mark Way even points at the tree and he's like, here's the mark. So it's like right at the same spot basically.
Yeah, so is it this sacrifice that has to happen every certain amount of years? And
the ambiguity of this story is one of the, I think, enduring things about it that makes it so fascinating is we don't know. And there's a lot of different readings you can do of it and you know, propose like what was actually going on, which is cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then do you have any final thoughts before we wrap things up and discuss our final thoughts on book and movie?
You know, there was a choice made to make this movie black and white. When I was talking to James about it, I think he said like this was a time where they could have done it in color.
Yeah.
They chose to do it in black and white, and I can see why. I think there are some things that work really well in black and white. I did miss a little bit of the garishness that's described in the book, and the idea that like all these different rooms have a color theme, and how like that probably would be kind of ugly. Like you could see how someone would think that's a good idea, but then you get in a room and it's all purple or it's all blue, like different shades of blue, and I'm like, that probably actually is kind of ugly. So I kind of missed that. I wanted to see what like the doctor's wearing this corduroy suit the whole time, and I'm like, what color is that corduroy suit? I really want to know. I assume it was like a dark brown. That was where I went, but I'm like, I don't know, maybe it's something else. So yeah, I guess I kind of missed the color, but ultimately it was fine, and I just thought it was a well-made movie, and it holds up pretty well. Yeah, I guess are we gonna do like a vote, or how do you do this about which is better?
You can go first. Just which you think wins? Is it the book or the movie?
Yeah,
and then.
Well, I think it is the book for me. One of my favorites. Like I said, the movie is pretty good, and honestly, it's a very faithful adaptation. The Flanagan adaptation is very, very different. Very cool, just very different. And ultimately, I'm glad that there is a faithful adaptation that exists like this. But yeah, even with Robert Weiss directing and it being so well made, there's a lot going for it. Ultimately, I still give it to the book for all the reasons I've described. Like I love Shirley Jackson's writing. I think it's a masterclass in so many ways of how to write a creeping dread style horror novel, and that's something I've always loved. So yeah, it's the book for me.
Yeah, same. And you talked about how it was so good at that creeping dread, and because the foreword is written by Joyce Carol Oates, we talk about that and Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? How Oates did a really good job at creating that unsettling dread too.
Yeah, she does.
And yeah, so I love the book as well. The book wins. The movie, I think I would have liked it better had I watched the movie without having read the book.
Okay,
but when you go into it knowing the book and just the depth the book has, and the movie, you know, it tries to capture that with Eleanor specifically, but the book is just on a whole nother level, and the movie definitely simplifies it, and they condense a lot of things. And so even though I like it, and I think it's one I would watch again, it's just when you compare it to the book, it's just not as good.
Yeah, that totally.
Yeah.
Can I tell your viewers, I would love, and listeners, for them to check out, you are going to be on our podcast, or I guess that episode is out now according to the timeline, as far as I understand it. We are covering The Hobbit, and we're doing a multi-part series where we did the book, and we're going to do an episode on each of the 3 Peter Jackson films, and we're having different guests on for each of them. And Laura is joining us for the final movie. And you're not the biggest fantasy fan, but we somehow talked you into watching the Battle of Five Armies movie and talking about it with us. So it should be fun. Those movies are what they are. But I think it'll be fun to talk about regardless.
Yeah, so this episode, it's October 19th. So the episode I was on for The Hobbit, I believe, will have been last week. So okay. I will link to those down below. Yeah. And again, I'm a huge fan of the Ink to Film podcast, so definitely check them out. I'm a Patreon, so I love supporting you guys doing that.
Which we greatly appreciate.
Yeah. And check out Luke's writing. So, yeah, you can send me a link. Or it's a physical magazine, or is it online?
So it is a physical magazine, but also you can get an ebook, and then the story itself will be published on their website in October 24th. I believe that's the date, unless I'm misplacing that. But my website is lukeelliottauthor.com, and I have links to all of my published short stories on there. So that's a good one to go to if you want to see any of that. I have a few others that are available for free online, and I write horror, I write fantasy, and I write science fiction, just depending on whatever the mood takes me. So if you like that kind of stuff, I'd love for you to read my work.
Yeah, and people can find you on Twitter, both for your personal Twitter as well as Ink to Film Twitter.
Yeah, my personal Twitter is @LuminousLuke, and then Ink to Film is @Ink to Film. Yeah, definitely follow us on there. That'd be great.
Yeah, and this has been awesome having you on again. It's been so cool collaborating with you guys this year. It's been really fun.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, and happy Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween, everybody. This is one of my favorite times of year, so yeah, I always love talking about the spooky stuff this time of year. And we'll be doing something right after The Hobbit. We'll be doing something spooky. I'm not sure if we've decided what it's going to be yet, but look for something to celebrate Halloween over on Ink to Film as well.
And even though I'm more particular with the horror movies and books I watch, even if it's a movie I know I can't handle, I still love hearing you guys talk about. Candyman was one that I really enjoyed your episode for that, even though...
Thank you. Clive Barker is definitely that extreme horror that you're not normally a fan of, it sounds like.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you again for being on my show. Definitely check out their podcast. Check out Luke's writing, which October 24th, I will link to that.
And thank you for having me.
And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to give it a rating and review. And I will see you next time. Bye.